middle of the program, and perhaps
Okay.
the organizers had faced some problems, and that is why they had asked me to do that, and they have sent me a reschedule of the program,
Uh,
and that it started yesterday.
okay. So, is there any place where I can find the new schedule? Because the
Yeah,
RC
I
page
forward the
does
schedule
not.
with me. I can share it with you. Uh,
It will be nice, sir.
it would be better to form a WhatsApp group among yourself, and you can include me so that whatever material I can share or whatever PDF I can share, you can get it directly. Is it okay?
Okay. Sure, sir.
Yeah. My number,
If no,
my
sir, if you
WhatsApp
could
number, you can
share
note it
it.
down.
Yes, sir. I will.
Okay. So you can take the number
Yes, sir.
94372
94372 59
59420.
420. Okay, sir. 94372 59420.
Yeah.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. So let us begin today's proceedings, and we will begin with 19th century Australian poetry today. Yesterday we had an introductory class and of block one, and today we can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So today we'll take up Australian poetry, 19th century Australian poetry, and more or less the things are in the shape of uh, British romantic poetry, and we will begin with the a short survey of Australian poetry, and I think the first poet laureate of Australia is Michael Massey Robinson, who was born in the year 1744 and died in 1826. He was a convict who landed in Australia in 1805, and in 1811 he obtained a pardon. He composed and published words in Sydney Gazette to celebrate the birthdays of George III and Queen Charlotte, 1810 to 21. So, in the Oxford Companion to Australian Literature, it is observed about Robinson that in 1818 and 1819, Robinson was repaid for his services as a poet laureate by a grant of 2 cows from the government head, probably the first royalties to a poet in Australia. So he received a kind of prize from the Australian settlement or Australian establishment, and we find that he is the first recognized poet to be awarded that poet laureate. As I have already told you yesterday, that these poets were convicts first, then poets next. They were the British prisoners, and they came to Australia um, as a prisoners because of the overcrowded prisons of Britain, England, and he, along with uh, poets like W.C. Wentworth, was, who was born in 1793 and died in 1872, is the who was the first native-born Australian to publish any verse. While at Cambridge in 1823, he composed the poem Australasia, which was a significant entry for the Chancellor's Prize for that year. So, W.B. Wentworth is the first original native-born Australian poet, and his well-known poem, which is there in your course, is Australasia. And the next poet of any importance is the a poet called Charles Harper, who was born in the year 1813 and uh, mm, died in say um, 1868, who was the son of the convict parents. He is the first Australian poet to take up the vocation of a poet seriously. And can you see my PPT? Hello.
Yes, sir, we can see, but it's not so clear,
Oh,
not so
it's not
legible.
clear. Okay, okay. I can share it in the WhatsApp. Okay, no problem. But I have highlighted some portions.
Yes,
You
sir, we
took
can
the
see that.
highlighted portion of the PPT.
Yes, sir, yes, sir.
Okay. So the most important early poet is Charles Harper, who was born in the year 1813 and died in the year 1868. And he was the son of a convict parents. And he is the first Australian poet to take up the vocation of a poet, the job of a poet seriously. And he published a some poem collections like Thoughts, a series of sonnets, The Passengers, a play in 5 acts and other poems, The Tower of the Dream, and several smaller works, a broadsheet, Song of Australia, Past series, pamphlet containing 2 poems entitled A Poet's Home and a 4-page booklet called A Ride. And the next important poet is Henry Kendall. We'll read about them in successive units, and each poet deserves one single unit, and you will have questions on these poets in your paper. One significant fact about Kendall is that he was virtually the only Australian born poet of his generation. He signed his poems H. Kendall and the initials standing for Native Australian Poet, NAP. And Kendall published 3 volumes of poetry, poems, and songs, 1862, Leaves from Australian Forests, 1869, and Songs from Mountains, 1880. His descriptive lyrics made Australia emerge as a tangible landscape in English poetry. And about him, Jeffrey Surley comments, it remains to be said that he was probably the best 19th century Australian poet who earned inclusion in Palgrave's Golden Treasury and the Oxford Book of English Verse. Australian lifestyle reflected in Australian poetry much more perceptibly by the expatriate poet Adam Lindsay Gordon. He arrived in Australia in 1853 and remained there till he committed suicide in 1870. In 1864, he published the ballad The Feud, and in 1867, he published Astaroth. His poetic reputation, however, rests on the poems published in two volumes, Sea Spray and Smoke Drift, and Bush Ballads and Galloping Rhymes. About him, Brian Eliot points out, nothing in all colonial poetry matches the importance of Gordon's signal achievement, the fixation of Australian image. Now we'll go to the next important poet, where we see that a name called A.B. Peterson, who is popularly known as a Benzo, because of his pseudonym for his early contribution to the magazine Bulletin. His first volume of poems entitled The Man from Snowy River and Other Verses, which was published in the year 1895, was a bestseller. And about him, H.M. Green highlights Peterson more than any other balladist, more indeed than any other Australian writer of verse, conveys to us the atmosphere of the Australian countryside and its inhabitants. Then we have another notable Australian woman poet of the century called Ada Cambridge, and her most important book of poems, Unspoken Thoughts, um, which was published in the year 1887, becomes very famous, and Patricia Barton sums up the themes of her poetry in the following passage. She says, Unspoken Thoughts expresses indignation at social and sexual injustice, longings for love, um, and sorry for interruption. Uh, she says about unspoken thoughts of Ada Cambridge. Unspoken thoughts expresses indignation at social and sexual injustice, longings for love and sexual expression, explorations of motherhood, fear of death and the agony of illness, and a challenging of conviction and orthodox beliefs. Unquote. So the span of 100 years of 19th century witnessed not only the growth and proliferation of Western civilization in the newly found continent of Australia, but also the development of poetry in English in a new landscape wherein a new civilization gradually matured. Australian poetry started under uh, marks of inheritance from the British poetry, but gradually absorbed the Australian themes from the nature and the people of Australia and simultaneously developed a matching Australian idiom and poetics. Thus, 19th century Australian poetry offers an interesting scope for studying the growth of a new kind of poetry, the various aspects of the same, uh, will be studied in the uh, units that follow, and where the first thing we find out is the history of Australian impact of British poetry. The history of Australian poetry is being influenced by British poetry. The Judith Wright has rightly commented that the history of Australian poetry from the first settlement in 1788, and you will, if you remember our last lecture, you will agree with me that 1788 is being hailed as the foundation day of Australia until the end of the First World War. Is largely a study in the adaptation of the European and especially English poetic consciousness and tradition to entirely new and apparently hostile conditions. The adaptation of English poetic diction of Britain is markedly apparent in the poetry of the early versifiers of Australia. For example, the following lines by M. Robinson immediately echoes the metrical rhythm of the heroic couplets used by Pope and the other poets of 19th century Britain. I am quoting a few lines now. While his proud knaves, while his proud navies aid the subject main, and now discoveries mark his glorious reign. Reviews the smiling dawn of open youth, when mutual virtue pledged connubial truth. Unquote. The English and Irish ballads also made an impact on Australian poetry. For example, Frank McNamara wrote a ballad about a convict, bold Jack Donahue, which is reminiscent of Robert Bourne's ballad style. Many anonymous ballads were composed and later published. They imitated the ballad style prevalent in Britain, and we have the impact of British poetry in early Australian poetry, and uh, the impact is quite clear and explicit. And how British poetry has its sway over Australian poetry is being summed up by Wilkes and mm, in the early verse about the early verses of Australia. He says, quote, for almost 50 years after the arrival of the first fleet, Australian poetry was under the influence of 18th century moods. One did not sit down to write poetry, one sat down to attempt an ode or an elegy or a satire and paid attention to the laws of genre, this thus observing the principle of decorum. Thus, we find Wentworth's poem Australasia as a public poem in the 18th century manner and observes the decorum of the ode. A few lines from the poem will illustrate the point. Quote, low, thickly planted over the glassy way where Sydney loves her beauties to survey, and every room, every morn delighted, sees the gleam of some fresh permanent pennant dancing in her stream, unquote. So, in this way, we find that um, the Australian poetry is largely indebted to the British poetry, like in India, we have some influence. The early Indian poetry is also largely influenced by the British poetry, and many people considered it as second-rate Hardy and Tennyson, the influence of Tennyson, Hardy, all these people are prominent in Indian uh, English poetry. The early Indian English poetry, of course, after, say, the birth of Nissi Magical or when he came to scene, everything changed. And you know about Kamala Das, they also came to change. They used their own language, own Indian English, and that is why there we find an existence of Indianness of Indian English poetry. Similarly, the early Australian poetry was predominantly influenced by the British poetry, and here Wilkes points out that a poem called Black Town, styled an elegy which belongs also to the genre of the local poem, like Pope's Windsor Forest, Alexander Pope, or Oliver Goldsmith's Deserted Village. Um, Here we see the direct influence of the British poetry on Australian poetry. Through the poetry of Harpur, another prominent poet, British Romanticism makes its first appearance in Australia. Wilkes observes in his poem, The Dream by Fountain, Harpur declares his love for motherland Australia through an imagery and imaginary encounter with the muse. Quote, be then the bard of thy country, O rather should such be thy choice than a monarchy wide, lo, it is the land of grave of thy father, it is the cradle of liberty, think and decide. This is Harpur's lines, and here we come to know about how they are striving to give an Australian accent to their poetry. And another poet is Kendall, and he is regarded as one of the uh, romantic poets, and he is the first poet to use the Australian landscape in the romantic mood. Uh, Bilkis has this observation about Kendall. Kendall is the foremost exemplar of the romantic treatment of Australian landscape in 19th century verse. Like Harpur, he was influenced by the romantic conception of the poet as a solitary dreamer. So the direct influence of British poetry is being found here, and besides the British influence, we have the flora and fauna of Australia. The Australian landscape is also very prominent, and in Wentworth's Australasia, the long poem, which you have in your course, um, depicts the Australian local landscape, and the following lines describes the typical Australian flora and fauna. Here, lowing kine, the bounding courses gaze. Here waves the corn, and there the woody maize. Here the tall peach puts forth its pinky bloom, and there the orange scatters its perfume. So these lines tell us about typical Australian experience and Australian landscape, where we find nature in its mm, plenty, and sometimes we find that the landscape, Australian landscape, is being addressed in English language. The mood, the style is English, the mood is English, the language is English, but the landscape, this place, the geography, is all about Australia. So this is about the landscape. Then we come to know the third important point is first is the British influence, second is the Australian landscape or pleasant landscape, and third one is the colonial setting and sentiment. How the colonial setting or colonial influence uh, modeled, moderated the Australian poetry. We will find in this section where in Wentworth's poem Australasia, which epitomizes the glorification of Britain and the celebration of the colonization of Australia in the following lines. And Australasia float with the flag unfurled. A new Britannia is another world. So in Australia, they justify the presence of Britain, and as if Britain's presence is highly essential for Australia to flourish in each and every respect. Now, the another thing that we find in the 19th century Australian poetry is estrangement and alienation. This is a very uh, prominent theme in Australian poetry of 19th century, and we find how the parallel themes of assimilation of landscape and the British influence of Romantic period is being imbibed in the new Australian poetry, and where the bizarre landscape of Australia and the um, reminiscences or remindings of the British homeland mixed up for the poetic material of the Australian poets. And here we find a deep sense of estrangement and alienation which the later poets gradually overcame. So there was a sense of alienation from their own landscape, British landscape, and British themes often crop up in Australian poetry. So what they would write and how they would write was the question, and they had to overcome this. Question of estrangement and alienation through a kind of practice, rigorous practice of poetry, where they could establish their own identity through more and more representation of Australian landscape and place. And another important theme is the mateship, how they were badly in need of a companion. So, as we have already discussed yesterday, that the Australian settlement came as a penal colony. Um, and it became a reality where more and more convicts from Britain arrived in Australian shore, Australian island continent. So the Australia now has an emerging phenomenon of bushmen and bush rangers. In the early phase, most escaped convicts ranging in the bush after lonely travels in the daytime through the dry land, the bush rangers settled for evening and met the fellow travelers camped in the bush and gradually developed a sense of mateship among themselves. The mateship gradually became a cult phenomenon. In the 19th century Australia, it acquired the mark of national identity of Australians. Particularly, the ballads of Australia celebrated this mateship among the bush rangers and horseman. The sense of mateship permeates the Australian poetry of the 19th century, and perhaps this accounts for sympathy and admiration for the escaped convicts who later were idolized as the cult figures. One example is the ballad The Wild Colonial Boy, which will be discussed in detail in other units that we will cover today. The chorus stanza of the ballad indicated the first hint of mateship. Quote, "Come, all my hearties, we will roam the mountains high, together we will plunder, together we will die. We will wander over the valleys and gallop over plains, and we will scorn to live in slavery, bound down with iron chains." Unquote. And this concept of mateship or companionship is rather important in case of sharing of feelings, because convicts had a set pattern of life, a set pattern of duty. So their urge for sharing emotions was prominent in early Australian poetry of 19th century. And then we come to know about the presence of a women's voice, which is also a very important theme in Australian literature. So the first uh, important poet is Ada Cambridge, woman poet, is Ada Cambridge, uh, whose book of poems we have already introduced to, is Unspoken Thoughts. And as pointed out in the earlier section, this women's protest, she articulates women's protest against the male domination in Australian society. And her poetry finds a separate unit in block 2, which we will cover today. And the another important aspect of early Australian poetry of 19th century was the Australian poetics. So, which is typically Australian in nature. Australian poetry in its initial phase depended on the poetics of the British poetry of the 18th century. So, Australian poetry of 19th century is roughly the replication of 18th century English poetry, which boasts of the narrative style, the ornamental rhetoric, rigidity in verse pattern, and heroic couplets of the 18th century. British poetry left their indelible stamp on the poetics of early Australian poetry, but at the same time, the simplicity and the colloquial diction of British ballads, many of which reached Australia with the convicts and other settlers who came from England, Scotland, and Ireland, found its way into the evolution of the Australian poetic diction of the 19th century. With the passage of time, a traceable impact of the style of Romantic and Victorian poetry is also discernible in the later evolution of Australian poetic style. So, initially, we find that the 18th century English poetry has become a kind of model for the um, Australian poetry of 19th century. Later, of course, we see that the style of Romantic and Victorian poetry also gets reflected in Australian poetry. The poetry of Harpur, Kendall, Gordon, Peterson, and Ada Cambridge exhibits a fusion of all the strands mentioned above. However, What transformed the poetic style of Australia during the 19th century is the fusion of the images and metaphors culled from Australian flora and fauna, local place, names, and the gradual evolution of the ethos of Australian milieu. So, what we find here is the language is English, the style is English, and the thinking is in English, but the place, the landscape, and the names, locality, and all these things are Australian. So they had a kind of a mix up of these two things to create a kind of a new distinctive indigenous style or indigenous flavor to Australian poetry of 19th century. This is very important for all of us. Now, with this kind of introduction, we will have a detailed reading of individual poems in the next uh, unit, which um, gives us the poem poems of or poetry of W.C. Wentworth. He is the first important poet and the poet who has written Australasia and ballads and folk songs of Australia. These two and the wild colonial boy. These three important poems, rather long poems, which are there in your course of study, you have to read W.C. Wentworth in some details. So, this man, W.C. Wentworth, who was the first major poet, Australian poet of 19th century, was born in 1793, 5 years after the Australian settlement. This is very important. He was born after the Australian settlement, which um, was which occurred in the year 1788. And being born in Australia, he was the first native Australian to have written poetry about Australia. He was the son of a surgeon and a magistrate, D.R.C. Wentworth and Catherine Crowley. He was born while his parents were en route from Sydney to Norfolk Island. He was sent to England for education. He came back to Australia in 1810. Thereafter, he was appointed uh, acting provost marshal by Governor Lachlan Macquarie in 1811. So he had this English influence uh, early in his career, and the characteristics of his poetry is Wentworth is the most noteworthy Australian poet who had shown commitment to the new country where he was born. So this rootedness to Australian landscape and geography and place is found in Wentworth. So the place names and the names of a typical flora and fauna of Australia um, endow his otherwise British poetic style with Australian flavor. Style is British, language is English, but the theme is typically Australian in nature because the place names are found prominently in his poetry, and the flora and fauna, the geographical, the atmospherical presence of Australia is very much found in his poetry. Wentworth rightly deserves to be regarded as the credible Australian pioneer poet. And His long poem, Australasia, is there in our course, and what the Oxford Companion to Australian Literature observes about this long poem of Wentworth is quite essential for us. With his, I quote the quotation from Oxford Companion to Australian Literature. With this, his opening apostrophe, land of my birth, Wentworth made clear his special position in relation to the topic. The poem attempts to project a distinctively Australian viewpoint, and with its prophecy of a future greatness, it is one of the first outbursts in Australian literature of nationalistic pride. So, this description about or this comment about the long poem Australasia by W.C. Wentworth tells us about the attempt of the poet to address Australian things in English language. The language is Australia, sorry, English, but the idiom is or the place is Australia. So we find a mix up of these two uh, realities, and this long poem is a kind of hallmark of Australian poetry of the 19th century. Then Eddie Hope, another important poet of merit, um, gives this assessment of Wentworth's poetry in early Australian um, literature or 19th century Australian poetry, and how he highlights Wentworth's theme and style is very important for all of us. But he says, quote, but anyone who had the taste of 18th century poetry will find it, the poem Australasia, anything but a dull poem. It is beautifully planned, it is plain, vigorous, passionate, and vivid, and eloquent. And if its verse is a little rough, the rosary touch is in keeping with its theme, and it is, in the best 18th century sense, a public poem, one in which the author, whose purpose was to devote himself to his country and who had taken trouble to know it thoroughly, celebrates it in terms which reflects his own patriotic fervor, but in terms that all could share. Now, this assessment of Eddie Hope, another important poet who comes later, about mm, Wentworth, is a very noteworthy one, and we must think the assessment which sums up Wentworth's features and style and his commitment to Australia, his rootedness to Australia, all these things are present in this long poem. And we can sum up Wentworth's Australasia, the long poem, in the following words. Wentworth's Australasia puts us in a position to access how difficult it was for the pioneer poets of Australia to start a poetic tradition where no tradition had existed. When you want to set the trend, you have to take the pain of the beginner, and sometimes um, we, the poets who risk to create something, a kind of a renaissance of sorts, he has to take all the pain of whether praise or criticism, and whether he gets success or he failed. All the things are blamed upon the person who wants to create something new. So, in the early 19th century, the Indian English poetry was also faced the same kind of fate. It was in the similar critical situation. Uh, the Indian tradition and culture existed when poets like Henry Doredio, uh, Susi Chandra Dutt, and Michael Madhusudan Dutt started writing in the first half of the 19th century. Similarly, in Australia, the white people had no local tradition to fall back upon. They had this problem of creating a tradition. In this perspective, Wentworth deserves to be reaccessed for his contribution as a pioneer poet of Australia. So the contribution of Wentworth is very prominent, and we have to start any mention of Australian poetry, 19th century Australian poetry, uh, by analyzing Wentworth's poem Australasia. Then the ballad and folk songs of Australia is also an important consideration in the uh, in this section. In the Oxford Companion to Australian Literature, reference is made to the times when the ballads in Australia were composed. In Australia, the terms folk song and ballad describe a body of song, often but by no means always of anonymous authorship, which tell the stories or depict Australian life and which have had currency among ordinary Australian people as a result of oral performance, particularly between the early days of European settlement and the advent of recordings and the radio. So all the things we find in ballads, which are um, predominantly in oral form, and then we have we would like to find out the authors. It is also a very difficult task because the anonymous authorship was there, and that is why we don't have much mention of these things, the ballads and the folk song. And the most important text of this type is The Wild Colonial Boy. And the text or the poem is in the ballad form, which is a hunting ballad cast in a cluster of simple words, rhythm, and images, embodying the heroism of the wild colonial boy. It presents a saga of bravery and through its rhythm, rhyme, and music, it reproduces the ethos of colonial days where bush rangers roamed and galloped through the wide valley in order to remain far away from the iron chains. The wild colonial boy of the ballad represents the spirit of freedom in Australia and the sense of heroic independence of the outlawed bush rangers who stood for bravery and who laid the foundation of future Australia. Hence, the ballad is an epitome of Australian bravery and uprightness of character. Therefore, the ballad gained currency among a wide section of Australians and even now it is read and heard with love, admiration, and attachment by all Australians. And let us sum up the text. We have already discussed W.C. Wentworth's um, poem Australasia. Now, this wild colonial boy is an Australian ballad that represents the early history of Australia. It chronicles the story of the escaped convicts who braved the wild bushes of Australia and laid their lives out of courage and bravado. The outdoor life of the early white Australians and their indomitable spirit to confront the challenges of life in a newly discovered country are typified by the bush hero depicted in the ballads. Thus, the ballads and folk songs play an important part of the development of indigenous Australian poetry that depicts the Australian outback and the Australian lifestyle in the 19th century. Australian poetry of 19th century thus provides a mirror to the 19th century Australia. So uh, this unit is devoted to uh, poetry of Wentworth and is a poem Australasia, then the ballad The Wild Colonial Boy, and uh, after that will come to discuss uh, another major poet in unit number 3. His name is Charles Harpur. Okay. And his poems were The Bush Fire, and another poem is A Midsummer Noon in the Australian Forest. These two important texts of Harpur we will discuss uh, briefly. Charles Harpur was born in 1813 in the valleys of Hawkesbury River in the New South Wales. Both his parents, Joseph and Sarah, were convicts transported to Australia. However, when Charles was born as their third child, they were emancipists. Charles lived his early life at Windsor. In the little town of Windsor, with its central square, its greenway, church, and the bridge across the river, Charles discovered his love for poetry and determined on his vocation. Later, in the Dream by the Fountain, he wrote of those days, making the Australian muse address him. I quote a few lines from the poem The Dream by the Fountain. For I felt thee even then wildly, wondrously, musing of glory and grace by old Hawkesbury side, scenes that then spread recordless around the suffusing with the purple of love. I behold thee and sighed for the fire, robe of thought and wound thee, betokening so much that the happy master dread, and whence there should follow, however, it renowned thee, what sorrows of heart and what labors of head. And this is Harper at its best for all of us. And Harper gives an account of his self-portrait in the poem. Quote, I was earnestly imaginative, simple of mind and simple of heart. I could greatly venerate whatever I could believe. in I could believe in as being righteous and true. I was affectionate to all, forgiveness, perhaps the weakness I was, as I am still an enthusiast in the cause of human liberty and progress, liberty in all directions and progress infinite. So this is the self-assessment of Harpur about the poem, and he had other poems uh, which are also important for all of us, but due to paucity of time, you have to cover other units, another 3 units within this short span of time. We will have to analyze the characteristic features of Harpur's poetry. Harpur's poetry is endowed with Australian dimension. From steep Western poetic mood, Australian poetry was released. It came under the impact of Romantic poetry through Harper's poetic efforts. Now, if you remember our earlier discussion, you would agree with me that earlier Australian 19th century Australian poetry was initially influenced by the 18th century English tradition, and Harper, for the first time, released this prosaic style of Western age, and moved to the free-flowing common language of Romantic poetry. And in one of his early poems, "The Dream by the Fountain," Harper expresses his dedication to poetry and, in particular, to the Australian muse, the poetic genius of his own country. I quote, "I am the muse of the evergreen forest. I am the spouse of the spirit, lone bird. Even in the days when thy boyhood there was, thy pastimes drew on thee, my dearest regard. For I felt thee even wildly, wondrously, musing of glory and grace by old Hawkesbury side." So this is a typical Australia in display now. Scenes that then spread recordless around the suffusing with the purple of love. I beheld thee, and sighed. Then would I prompt in the still hour of dreaming some thought of thy beautiful country again. So Harper addresses the muse, Australian muse, and he describes his experiences, which are typically Australian in nature. And the Oxford Australia companion to Australian literature um records Harper's accent on Australian landscape, as well as the handling of traditional verse forms of projecting the Australian scenery in the following passages. Quote, "In the early years of settlement, when colonial poetry was largely ignored or decried, Harper's ambition was to be Australia's first authentic poetic voice. He believed that Australian poetry should be modelled upon traditional English verse before seeking its own individuality. Thus, his own poetry relies heavily on traditional poetic techniques such as ornamental diction, wide use of personification and metaphor, solemnity of tone, and ponderous movement, while attempting on some occasions at least to describe and interpret the colonial Australian scene. Such attempts include is nature in the snowy mountains, the bush fire, and a storm in the mountain, which describe some of the typical thoughts, more dramatic components of the Australian landscape and convey a sense of vast distance and wide horizons. Unquote. So this is uh, Charles Harper in brief, and we have the bushfire test and other things. Then we will have a small comment on the poem, The Bushfire, which is regarded as the first poem in English on a typically Australian natural phenomenon. And it has been able to create and preserve the portrait of Australian bushfire of the 19th century. The bushfire was a wild, ferocious occurrence of nature at a time when the bush was an all-pervasive phenomenon in colonial Australia. And Australian fire, we know about it, and in recent years, fire also broke out in the countryside. And another poem is Midsummer Noon in the Australian Forest, which is also a long poem, and it tells us about the most popular and anthologized poem, which has been appreciated and praised for its creation of the vision of somnolent atmosphere of summer noonday in the Australian bush. The most striking feature of the poem is its soothing, lulling lyricism, where the bush fire is written in blank verse. Harper uses tri-meter rhyming couplets and noon, midsummer noon. This exhibits the wide range of Harper's command over a variety of metrical patterns. In midsummer In a midsummer noon, the poet uses a tripling rhythm with several metrical variations in order to convey and impress the lyrical atmosphere and mood on the reader's mind. Harper's art has been so effective that readers' response is immediate. We find Harper's poetry very interesting because the mood and the kind of rhythm that we find in mm, the evocativeness, emotional evocativeness that is present in Harper's poetry, all these are star attractions for the readers, for all of us. And let us have a clear-cut summing up of Harper's poetry. Harper's position in the 19th century Australian poetry is unique and special. He is the first Australian poet who seriously took upon himself the task of developing Australian poetry. For Harper, poetry was not a mere amateurish pastime. He gave Australian poetry a mission, a goal. He harnessed the resources of British poetry for portraying the various aspects of Australian landscape and Australian people. Chaucer is said to be the father of English poetry. In the same token, we can say that Harper is the father of Australian poetry. And that brings us to the next unit, which discusses another important poet, and he is Henry Kendall, and his poems, Bellbirds, and after many years, are there in our course of study. We will have some brief discussions about the poem. And this man, Henry Kendall, was born when Charles Harpur was 26 years old. So the influence of the poet or the model that Kendall was searching when he began writing poetry is definitely Charles Harpur. And Kendall's first volume of poems and songs was published in it. Kendall confesses in a letter to Harpur. So there was a good relationship between these two poets, Harpur and Kendall, and he um, dedicates his volume to um, Charles Harpur. I feel already deeply indebted to you for the great good and large comfort I have derived from your writings. There is no living author to whom I could turn and say as much. This may be a necessary result of my Australian birth and education, but strangely fascinated by almost everything you have published. I have always looked upon you as the man who alone could express what I had so often dimly thought. Unquote. This is Harper's version about Henry Kendall. So the relationship between Harper and Kendall uh, begins a new saga of poetry in Australia in 19th century, and it's a phenomenon of succession in the field of Australian poetry during the third quarter of the 19th century, later half of the 19th century. Kendall strengthens the position of Harper through his admiration of Harper's poetry. And it is Kendall who recognized and celebrated the importance of the poetic talent of Harper and valued his supremacy among the poets following his footsteps. A few lines from his poem addressed to C.H. are quoted for um, our knowledge. I would sit at your feet, for I feel I am one of the glorious band that ever will own you and hold you, their chief and a monarch of song in the land. In his poem on the death of Harpur, Kendall pinpoints how the Australian landscape has found a permanent image in Harpur's poetry. Quote, strange words of wind and rhymes of rain and whispers from the inland fountains and mingled in his various strain with the leafy breeze of piney mountains. We find mountains, we find the rain, we find the wind, all are typically Australian in nature. Through his admiration of Harpur's poetry and his emphasis on certain features of Harpur's poetry, Kendall betrays his own predilections. Kendall, too, was a poet of Australian landscape and had assimilated the influence of the Romantic and British Victorian poetry of Britain. Kendall spent his impressionable boyhood in the coastal districts of Jawara in the south and Clarence in river in the north. Their cool, moist rainforests, deep shadowed gullies, and lost pastures are evocatively portrayed in Kendall's best-known poems. The landscape lyrics such as Bellbirds, September in Australia, Araluen, and Narara Creek. A pertinent critic, Green, has made an accurate estimate of Kendall's position as an Australian poet. uh, which will be of some importance for all of us. Key quotes. Kendall is much more than merely a landmark in Australian poetry. Harper was that and a little more as well, but Kendall is one of the Australia's leading poets, a landmark besides. His imitations are as evident as his qualities, but his position is unassailable in its own kind, has not been surpassed here, and in the poetry of English speaking peoples also he has a definite place, if not a high one. The two strands that have come together to form Australian literature were for the first time introduced in Kendall's second book of poems, Leaves from Australian Forests, uh, in 1869. 8 years after its beginnings, the young literature has produced a book that was Australian in a sense in which no other book has been. With this, therefore, Australian literature, in the narrow sense of the word, may be a, said to have begun. The rootlet had not merely struck, it had produced a board. This fact was early recognized in England as well as Australia. Besides, the Echinium's phrase, wild by no means, a favorable review of Sladen's Century of Australian Song, which contained some of Kendall's best work, spoke of his marvelous music and said that his poetry was full of beautiful things, and some of Kendall's poems were included by Palgrave's in his Golden Treasury and by Quiller Couch in the Oxford Book of English Verse. This is a very good assessment of Kendall, and let us find out the characteristic of Kendall's poetry as recorded in the Oxford Companion to Australian Literature. Quote, Kendall's literary reputation, extraordinarily high in his own lifetime and immediately after his death, but never at the same peak in this century, still rests chiefly on his lyric poetry. Bellbards, September in Australia, and the Song of Cattle Hunters, with their elaborate world pictures, extravagant melody, and haunting melancholy, endeared themselves to succeeding generation of Australian readers and established Kendall as a favorite schoolroom poet. Unquote. And the companion also mentions other types of poetry written by Kendall as well. Quote, Kendall's affectionate thought taught commentaries on the colonial outback types, for example, Bill the Bullock's driver, the Jim the Splitter, are now seen to have anticipated Henry Lawson's and Abby Peterson's. These two poets will come in the next unit. Portraits of similar high characters. His love poetry, especially Rose Lauren and At Nightfall, which tells which tell of his lost love for Rose Bennett and the poignant um, Aurelian and on a street, which reflected his guilt about years 1869 to 72, are the powerful statements of the problems of his troubled life. His patriotic verse, such as the fair future, which attempts to create new loyalties and new hopes. His public poems, written for important occasions such as 1879 international exhibitions in Sydney. His memorial verse of Charles Harper, James Lylon Michael, and Adam Lindley Gordon, and his attempt in the fragmentary The Australian Shepherd to begin the first Australian rural epic all support the claim that Kendall was the most substantial poet of the colonial period. Now, this is all about Kendall's greatness as a poet. So, we can have something about the Bell Bars, a very famous poem by Kendall, which tells us the typical Australians mossy arbors and woodlands where bellbirds' music echoes incessantly and recreated by Kendall, which are recreated by Kendall in a series of words, images, and rhythms, and perpetuate the poet's perception of Australian landscape, suffused with his memories of his childhood and adolescence. Excuse me. Nature and man are fused into the poem that attains the position of a landmark in the evolution of Australian poetry during the 18th century. This poem is representative of the stage of progress achieved in the development of Australian poetry by the third quarter of the 19th century. This is about the bell cats. Then we have another poem after many years, which tells us about the vision of the future. Though tinged with sadness, the poem indicates the poet's relation with the land, how the land kindles in him a hope for the future. Quote, I cannot dream the dream again, but when the happy birds are singing in the sunny rain, I think I hear its words. The relation, the relation between the land and the poet is not only a romantic lyrical infatuation, but also represents at that point of time the close bond developing between the land of Australia and the white settlers. The relationship is, however, embodied in a very moving manner through a few words only. Words are few, but emotion is deep. Kendall's mastery over the medium of poetic communication expressed itself in a very effective manner. Ah, I am quoting again. Ah, oftentimes I used to look upon its banks and long to steal the beauty of that brook and put it in a song. So, what he experiences in the riverbanks and in the brook, he now tries to materialize that experience through a song or poem. So, what we can sum up Kendall's poetic contribution. Kendall's signal contribution is uh, traced in his love and admiration of Australian landscape. He also brought in more flexibility in versification and metrical patterns. His nature lyrics are soothing, but tinged with a touching sadness. Hence, Kendall's poetry is to be admired, and his poetic efforts are appreciated for their signal contribution to the growth of Australian poetry. Now, this brings to us the unit number 5, where we find that poets like L. Gordon and A.B. Peterson, with their poems like The Sikh Stock Rider and The Man from Snowy River, respectively, figure prominently in Australian 19th century Australian poetry. L. Gordon was born in Scotland and had his education in England. But after he migrated to Australia in 1853, Gordon engaged himself in the adventures of life in Australia, horse riding, steeplechasing, politics, and publishing, and created lively ballads out of them. It is Gordon who first made the horse an Australian poetic image and metaphor, standing for energy and speed of people in Australia. Similarly, Abby Peterson was born in the year 1864 and died in the year 1941. He is the chief balladist of Australia. His early ballads kept on appearing in the bulletin from 1886 onwards. The first ballad from Peterson published in the bulletin was A Dream of the Melbourne Cob, a long way after Gordon. Peterson signaled the ballad with a pseudonym, the banjo, the name of a racehorse of Peterson's fancy. The verses which he published regularly in the bulletin from 1886 onwards were collected in 1895 in a book entitled The Man from Snowy River and Other Verses. Its success was outstanding. No later collection of Bush ballads can compare with it. The first edition was very popular and sold out in a fortnight. 10,000 copies were sold in the first year. The succeeding volumes of Peterson's poetry were published in the first half of the 20th century. Hence, they fall outside the purview of this discussion. Coming to L. Gordon, his full name is Adam Lindsay Gordon, who was born in the year 1833 and died in 1870. He was born at Fyle in the Azores in Scotland. He had his education in England. In 1853, he was banished by his parents to South Australia. In a poem entitled To a Sister, which he wrote 3 days before he sailed for Australia, he confessed, quote, My parents bade me cross the flood. My kindred frowned at me. They say I have belied my blood and stained my pedigree, but I must turn from those who sighed and laugh at those who frown. I cannot quench my stubborn pride, not keep my spirits down. Unquote. In South Australia, he enlisted in the mounted police. After 2 years, he resigned from the constabulary service and drifted about South Australia, dealing in horses and riding in steeplechases. He received a legacy from his parents' estate and then purchased several properties, married and lived in Dingley Dell, a small stone cottage still lovingly preserved near the seaside settlement of Port Macdonald. From those years come many stories of Gordon's daring feats of horsemanship. So more than a poet, he has some favorite pastimes also, and the Oxford Companion to Australian Literature gave a concise estimate of Gordon's reputation as a poet. Quote, in 1934, a bust of Gordon was unveiled in the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey, making him the only Australian poet to have been thus honored. That mark of recognition reflects the adulation for him after his death and through the first decades of 20th century. His popularity sprang partly from the romantic aura of his life, his aristocratic background, his exile in the colony, his reckless riding exploits, and the pathos of his death. It sprang, too, from the gratitude of Australian nationalists for Gordon's acclaim in his poetry of the outback way of life. His verses were loved and recited around campfires and the homesteads and shearing sheds of back blocks. Unquote. Now, another prominent critic, Brian Elliott, accesses Gordon's poetic talent from another point of view. He says, quote, Gordon made two striking but indispensable discoveries. First, he discovered the colonial audience itself, the heart of colonial moral and aesthetic awareness, and words, however rough, through which to reach it. And second, the warmth and vitality of Australian light, especially the archetypal of the summer sky and long horizon. The skylines, blue furnished resistance. Nothing in all colonial poetry matches in importance Gordon's signal achievement, the fixation of the Australian image. Emotionally, he simply spoke as he felt. The mood of his best work is conversational, its philosophy stoically green but spontaneously articulate. It's a visionary content based upon a broad impressionism, the keynote of brightness and sunlight, straight, a high luminosity in the air. So this sums up Gordon's greatness as a poet of 19th century Australia. Then we have the Sikh talk about Rider, another poem, and where we see the importance or the contribution of the poem to Australian literature in the following words by Brian Eliot again. Quote, in its day, this Sikh stock rider seemed to epitomize the mood and atmosphere of colonial experience. Essentially, a bush poem, it is impressionistic, reminiscent, relaxed, familiar. Its great significance, however, lay not in what it was, but what it did. The poem alone captured, defined, and established for its very period the local image and the fixed and the hitherto hesitant, wavering local nostalgias. Henceforward, no colonial poet could write without remembering it. It represented an emotional point of rest, an end to lost political causes, and a new creative beginning. This is indeed a very good assessment of uh, the poem, The Sikh Stock Rider. We have the characteristic features of Patterson's poetry, and where he focuses on the 19th century Australian landscape, and this poem, Prelude, mm, which are quoted below, the lines are quoted below, will tell us how Patterson's poetry is important for all of us. Quote, I have gathered these stories afar, in the wind and the rain, in the land where the cattle camps are, on the edge of the plain, on the overland roads of the west, when the watches were long, I have fashioned in earnest and jest these fragments of song. Are you there? Any problem? So many poems are there by Peterson and Gordon, and we can sum up their poetry in the following words. Clement Semler rightly pointed out the poetry of um, these two poets. Quote, the phenomenon of this ballad is that it is still a household word nearly 90 years after it was written. If we reflect on its success, we see that Patterson combined several elements in its writing that have marked the most successful Australian ballads: excitement, a genuine feeling, indeed love for its bush setting, and a statement of the dominant Australian characteristic to give it a go and take a risk. The Man from Snowy River has never lost its popularity, and this is primarily because, like other great ballads in our literature, it sustains the images still admired in the present day of adventure, courage, and determination, triumph over the seemingly overwhelming odds. So, when we sum up Gordon and Patterson's poetry, we can have this. After Bentworth, Harper, and Kendall had built the foundation of Australian poetry, Gordon and Patterson started building the base of the superstructure of Australian poetry. It is really a wonderful phenomenon of stylistic variety and thematic width that the two later poets brought into Australian poetry through their ballads that put accent on the lives of the Australian commoners like bush rangers and stockmen, and they replaced the stiff 18th century poetic diction and romantic Victorian blissful lyricism with a robust and matter of fact colloquial style that is marked of real lifestyle, lifelike style of conversation among the Australians. So this projection of a colloquial style and a local idiom rootedness to the soil is being established in Australian poetry by the two poets, Patterson and Gordon. Now, with this, we come to the unit number 6, where we will find discussion of women poets like Ada Cambridge and uh, her poem, An Answer, and this poetry or poetry by Ada Cambridge is important in the sense that it represents the women viewpoint for the first time in Australian poetry of 19th century. Ada Cambridge was born in the year 1844 and died in the year 1926. Is the most important Australian woman poet of the century. Besides being a poet, she is well known as a novelist, like Patterson's Cambridge Life, and works also extend to the first quarter of the 20th century. But we confine the discussion today to 19th century poetry only. There were a few other women poets who published poems during the 19th century, but none of their works registered women's protest against male values or the male subjugation of women in the society as articulately and pronouncedly as Cambridge's poem, published mainly in her controversial book of poems, Unspoken Thoughts, 1887. Ada Cambridge was born and raised in Norfolk, England. During her youth, she published moral tales and verses which reflected her strong religious feelings. In 1870, she married a young curate, George Frederick Gross. After marriage, the couple left for Victoria in Australia, where Gross served as an Anglican minister at Wangaratta, Ecandas, Ballan, Colleran, Sanddost, Bendigo, and Benchworth before moving to Williamson Town in 1893. Cambridge's colonial experience is chronicled in her perceptive autobiography, 30 Years in Australia, which was published in 1903. Cambridge's first book of poems, The Manor House and Other Poems, was published in 1875, and we find the influence of Tennyson and Pre-Raphaelites in um, Cambridge's poem. Her second book of poems, Unspoken Thoughts, published by Kegan Paul of London in 1887, is a major event in the annals of women's poetry of Australia. However, because of its controversial nature, the book was withdrawn from circulation by Cambridge herself. The book was published anonymously. Several of the poems of the book contained extremely controversial ideas. Bradstock and Wakeling comment about the controversial status of the poem in the uh, following manner. Quote, was she Cambridge, hoping that those poems, many of them extremely controversial, would be more objective, received if the name of a female author was suppressed, given the fact that she carefully avoided a reference to the collection in either of two books of memoirs. Her motivation must remain a matter of speculation. Perhaps, like so many women writers before and since, she needed to distance herself from the private thoughts once they had entered the public domain. Such self suppression would be paralleled to the attitudes of those earlier mothers of the novel, who were torn between the need to write and the norms of invisibility required of them as ladies. This denial of agency, this, this time by the women writer herself, might have occurred because Cambridge already felt considerable ambivalence about how her unorthodox thoughts might be received. Unquote. And about the unspoken thoughts, the collection of poems, it says, they say, the critics say that unspoken thoughts is a volume of polemical poetry. It is the radical nature of the arguments pursued that is the greatest surprise. According to A.G. Stephens, when the collection was first published, the shock of the Reverend George Cross was overwhelming, and if so, we can assume that it was not the quality of the rhyme which disturbed him. Cambridge tries to challenge the male domination through her poetry, and it's obvious that many odds she has to fight against to establish her identity as a women poet. Um, However, H.M. Green gives her high position as a woman poet. According to Green, quote, Cambridge is not merely the first Australian woman poet who matters at all, but remains today among the best of Australia's women poets. She was the first Australian writer of prose or verse to whom social problems really mattered. Indeed, they mattered to her so intensely that they aroused in her a passion of resentment. She was the first of the Australian poets of revolt. Unquote. So this is about Cambridge and the Oxford Companion to Australian Literature again speaks about unspoken thoughts in the following manner. uh, Reveals the religious uncertainty, deals frankly with sexuality and marriage, and expresses a strong concern for the socially disadvantaged. It further notes that the poem which discusses religious uncertainty, the long opening poem, The Shadow, sexuality, for example, the physical conscience, a wife's protest, and marriage. For example, the poem and answer, the fallen, might have embarrassed or offended her clergyman husband George Cross. Unspoken Thoughts, as its name suggests, offers poems in which Cambridge has expressed her original radical anti-establishment ideas, which could not be expressed in public life in those days. Excuse me. Hence, the poems in the volume affirm Cambridge's literary and intellectual courage, when in the next section, one of her poems, in fact, the last poem of the volume, is analyzed. It will be shown how radical her thoughts were, how forthright she was in her expression. Excuse me. The poem A Street Riot is a justification of the uprising of the poorer classes, and at the same time, a suggestion was there that there is a humanitarian solution to social unrest. Quote, must brute force rise and social order fall? Ere these starved millions can be clothed and fed? Unquote. So the text, an answer, is only an answer by a woman like Ada Cambridge, who protests against the male domination of that period. And here, the poem, An Answer, which is the last poem of the volume Unspoken Thoughts, it is not only a representative poem of Cambridge as a feminist rebel, but also being placed at the last page of the volume. It seems to represent the climax of Cambridge's feminist rebellion. The extreme position of women advocated by the poem was shocking even for the female social reformer of the day. The leading suffragist and social reformer of the time, Rose Scott, wrote about this poem. Quote, this poem is the one I am sorry is in this book. The poem espouses the freedom of women in a male dominated society where the wife is often treated as a legitimized prostitute. Cambridge gave voice to the women whose spirit is rebellious and wants to uphold her own freedom of choice. The poem strikes us because of the force of the statements, the intensity of subjective expression, and the directness with which the woman states whatever she wants to state. In this poem, the feminist poetry of Australia finds a universal articulation. The poem is striking not only because it has transcended the formality of Victorian rhetoric and idiom found often in Cambridge poetry. Let us sum up Cambridge poetry in the following words. During the 19th century, the history of Australian poetry presents several landmarks in its progress. Cambridge poetry, published during the last quarter of the 19th century, added a new dimension to Australian poetry. The Australian poetry became representative of the wide variety achieved in the spectrum of Australian culture over 100 years of the 19th century. That women registered the protest in books of poetry speaks of the latitude of the Australian society and culture that found a true reflection in the 19th century Australian poetry. So this is um, about um, poetry of Radha Cambridge, and I think we have come to the end of today's discussion. And if you have any doubts, you can ask me for some 15 minutes, and after that, we'll stop our today's proceedings.
Hello. Good evening.
Hey, good evening, good evening. Please ask what is your problem.
Sir, today, so, yes,
Your
yeah,
voice is not clear.
the get the correct you.
Actually, sorry, I can't hear you.
Yes, sir. Now audible to you?
I can listen to you, but the problem is the voice is not clear.
Today is my came here.
Next your question. Text.
Yes, text. We are asking about text.
Text your question. Question.
Oh, questions.
Sir, I am
The voice is not clear. That is the problem.
the videos which are placed on YouTube any other
Okay. I can give you questions tomorrow.
आपको को text your question. Message करो. Text करो.
Okay, okay. Uh, things are not clear, and we can stop here. Whatever your problems are, you can WhatsApp me. I have given you the number. Maybe tomorrow we can sort out the problems.
Text अच्छी. 8 text अच्छी.
Detailed list.
Message box.
Okay, okay. I will find out your queries in from the message box.
Sir, share the WhatsApp number or any link so that we can connect to you
My
through.
number is 94372 59420. This is my WhatsApp number. You can make a WhatsApp group so that we can exchange and share our ideas, problems can be sorted out, all the things.
Sir, can you repeat your number once again?
94372 59420. Yes. Okay. Let me stop now. Uh, Tomorrow we will discuss the third block, and if you have any doubts, you can WhatsApp me. We will discuss later. Thank you.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much for today's class.
Hello.
Hello.
So, huh, if you have the WhatsApp link, then
Hey, like what I'm trying to say is can we open a like personal WhatsApp group for only students?
Yes, we can.
So go ahead. Can anyone make a WhatsApp group? Send the link here.
Hello, please send the WhatsApp link here. Actually, how many groups are there in WhatsApp for MEG group?
So many are in WhatsApp MEG group.
No, no, MEG actually so many are there. That is, they are only sending for the advertisement for assignment. For the class, how many are there?
No, no. You are in which session? Means 2024.
Yes, January 24.
January 24 means so many
Yeah,
groups
January
are there.
24.
January 24 means so many groups are there.
No,
So
in this told and the people. in the group. Will
Can't, it
be
can't connect because your
what?
voice is not clear. Your voice is not clear. Can you send me?
Yes. Hello.
Hello?
Hello. So actually, I am asking you that
Hello?
is today's Saturday. Yes. Hello.
Hello? Can't,
Hello.
can't connect.
Hello.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello?
Uh, Hello. Hello. Yes. Am I
Yes, I
audible
can
now?
hear.
Hello.
Yes, yes.
So, is sir
Hello?
told that he will? Yes. Hello.
Hello? I cannot audible.
Now am I audible?
Hello? Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Hello.
Hello?
So
The
actually, I
voice
am
is
asking you
not
that
clear.
if
Hello?
yes. Hello.
You can continue.
Huh. So actually, I am telling about that. Sir told that he will send the PPT in the WhatsApp group. So I actually need that link, that WhatsApp group link. So please send that
Oh,
link.
I
Means in
also
which
don't
group
have
sir
that.
is sending.
I also don't have the link.
Is it your first class today?
Yes. All are in January 2024 session, na?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Okay.
Sir, if you have the link, please send the now in the message so that we can join here.
No, I have no
Hello.
link, but hello?
Yes.
I have no link.
Hello, Mohit sir. Am I Mohit? Abu sir. Hello.
Hello?
Hello. If in WhatsApp link, please send that.
Hello?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Are you in this WhatsApp group?
No, not yet.
Hello. In that WhatsApp group?
No.
Please